If you think you know exactly how the War of the Ring played out, you might want to double check your sources. Millions of fans walk around with a version of Middle-earth in their heads that is completely fabricated for Hollywood. You think that the Ents originally voted against going to war? Nope. You think Pippin had to sneak around to light the beacons of Gondor? Not at all. You think Gimli was written as comic relief? Not really. Peter Jackson's trilogy is a cinematic masterpiece, but when adapting a sprawling epic, sacrifices have to be made to keep audiences on the edge of their seats. So today, we're diving back into the books to deprogram the Hollywood lore and count down 8 more massive myths that the movies led you to believe. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to Fact or Fantasy, a channel dedicated to all things Tolkien. If you're new here and you enjoy lore deep dives, book versus film analysis, and much more, then consider subscribing. As always, I want to give a huge shout out to Jason, Joshua, Timothy, RoboSteve, Drix, Andy, Maha, and the rest of my incredible Patreon and YouTube members who help make these videos possible every month. So why did I say 8 more myths? Well, that's because I already made a video a while ago about the biggest misconceptions the movies planted in the Lord of the Rings fandom. So if you haven't watched that yet, I'll link it in the description so you can watch it after this video. But anyway, with that being said, grab a cup of tea, sit back, relax, and let's dive into our first myth, which centers around everybody's favorite dwarf. If your only exposure to Middle-earth is through the films, then your perception of Gimli, son of Gloin, is probably pretty skewed. In the movies, starting in the Fellowship of the Ring and escalating heavily throughout the rest of the trilogy, Gimli is utilized primarily as a mechanism for comic relief. He's boisterous, clumsy, easily winded, and constantly the butt of physical jokes. Whether he's getting tossed across a chasm by Aragorn, losing a drinking game to Legolas, or cracking a joke in the middle of a serious conversation, cinematic Gimli is there to break the tension. But the literary Gimli is entirely different. In Tolkien's text, Gimli is a highly dignified, solemn, and formidable warrior, and more importantly, his defining character trait isn't his comedic timing, it's his resolute and profoundly poetic heart. Tolkien uses Gimli to heal the ancient bitter rift between elves and dwarves, and he does this by showing Gimli's immense capacity for reverence. The greatest example of this happens in Lothlorien. When Galadriel asks Gimli what gift he desires, he doesn't ask for gold or gems, which are stereotypically associated with dwarven greed. Instead, he bows low and respectfully asks for a single strand of Galadriel's hair, stating that it surpasses all the gold and jewels of Middle-earth. Galadriel recognizes the pure reverence in his request and gives him 3 strands of her hair. This is a massive lore moment, because millennia prior, the greatest elven smith in history, Fëanor, asked for a strand of her hair 3 different times and was denied every single time because of his pride. Gimli's humility earns him what the greatest elf could not obtain. Later, Gimli delivers a sweeping, incredibly romantic monologue to Legolas about the glittering caves behind Helm's Deep, describing them with such poetic beauty that Legolas promises to explore them with him after the war. As for his bravery and resolute nature, Aragorn says that if the Fellowship hadn't broken, the group that went to Mordor would have been Sam, Frodo, Aragorn, and Gimli. This subtly places Gimli over Legolas in terms of pure endurance, because Legolas doesn't make that list. Additionally, while the movies make Legolas the center of attention as he almost single-handedly saves the day time after time, Tolkien writes that Legolas accomplished the least out of all the Fellowship. This means that Tolkien ranks Gimli higher in terms of his impact during the War of the Ring. By reducing Gimli to a caricature of boisterous ineptitude, the film sacrificed the profound thematic weight of a dwarven warrior who is ultimately captivated by transcendent beauty, and brave enough to journey into the land of shadow. Now, I know this is a hot debate as it's been mentioned about 10,000 times in my comment sections, but I need to mention that I actually like Gimli in the movies. Do I acknowledge that he's way different than the books? Of course. But does his character work in the films too? Yeah, mainly because every other character is changed as well. If they only changed Gimli and kept everyone else book accurate, it wouldn't make much sense. But when adapting something, making a change often has a butterfly effect, and I think turning Gimli into a slightly more comedic version of his book self was a symptom of much larger changes earlier on. But that's just my opinion. And that being said, as we dive into the remaining myths today, keep in mind that I love both the books and movies. This isn't a place to hate on one or the other, but to appreciate and nerd out about both. Now with that, let's head into myth number 2. In the Two Towers film, there is a sequence that constantly keeps first-time viewers on the edge of their seats. As the refugees of Edoras march toward Helm's Deep, they are ambushed in broad daylight by orcs riding wargs. During the chaos, Aragorn gets tangled up with a warg and is dragged over the edge of a massive cliff, and falls into a raging river. Legolas and Gimli mourn his apparent death, but Aragorn eventually washes ashore, gets a psychic kiss from Arwen to wake him up, and rides back to the fortress just in time to warn everyone about the approaching Uruk-hai army. It's a dramatic sequence, and it's also entirely made up. In Tolkien's original text, this daylight ambush and the subsequent cliff fall never occur. The logistical movement of the people of Rohan is handled with far greater military pragmatism. King Theoden does not send his vulnerable civilian population to a military choke point like Helm's Deep. Instead, the non-combatants, led by Éowyn, are sent to the hidden safety of Dunharrow. The fighting men, accompanied by Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, ride directly and swiftly to the Hornburg. Their journey is mostly unimpeded, and Aragorn arrives safely without ever taking a swan dive off a cliff. There is kind of a bonus myth hidden inside this. Did you catch it? King Theoden doesn't take his entire population to Helm's Deep, where he figures they'll all die. In fact, Theoden in the book is very wise and courageous, and nowhere near giving up, let alone sacrificing his people due to his own mental shortcomings. But back to Aragorn, why did Peter Jackson add this? It's just classic manufactured tension for the film. The literal march to Helm's Deep in the books lacks physical conflict, and a 3-hour film requires rhythmic spikes in adrenaline to keep the audience engaged. Furthermore, separating Aragorn allowed the film to visually establish the massive scale of the Uruk-hai army as he crests the hill alone to see them marching toward Helm's Deep. And of course, we can't ignore that it gave Peter Jackson an excuse to insert Arwen, since we don't read about her at all during this part of the book, and the movie wanted us to be reminded of Aragorn's connection with her about every 30 minutes. Now moving on to myth number 3, we come to the Ents, and this is one of the craziest changes in my opinion. If you've read the books, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The portrayal of the Ents and their decision to march on Isengard represents a fundamental divergence in how the story treats the natural world's agency. In the movie, the Entmoot concludes with a definitive vote against going to war. Treebeard literally tells Merry and Pippin that the Ents will just weather out the storm. It isn't until the hobbits use some clever trickery, commanding Treebeard to walk south toward Isengard, that the Ent sees the deforestation. Horrified and suddenly enraged, Treebeard screams, and the other Ents instantly rush out of the woods, and they unilaterally decide to attack Saruman. This cinematic portrayal makes the Ents look incredibly ignorant of their own borders, and it makes their 3-day council totally pointless. Also, how were their other Ents just right there ready to go? Unless they were secretly following Treebeard the whole time, but I don't think that's possible because we're under the impression that the Ents don't really meet to talk all that often, and they live very far from each other. But anyway, what really happens here? In the books, the literary Ents do not require hobbit trickery to perceive the state of their own domain. During the Entmoot, Treebeard and the other Ents are already acutely aware of Saruman's treachery and the relentless destruction of their trees. The purpose of the Entmoot is not to discover whether Saruman is evil, they already know that, but to democratically and deliberately decide to marshal their forces for war, fully aware that this assault might mean the end of their ancient dwindling race. They actively decide to march on Isengard during the gathering itself, achieving a unified consensus through dialogue rather than a sudden outburst of shock. The hobbits don't trick them, they just act as the final catalyst. The film changed this to give Merry and Pippin a more active, heroic role in triggering the conflict, which fits the Hollywood requirement for protagonist agency. After all, they don't want to make the hero some guy we just met, they'd rather give that to Merry and Pippin. But it comes at the cost of Tolkien's portrayal of nature as a slow and immensely wise, unstoppable force that deliberately decides its own fate. Speaking of Pippin, for myth number 4, we have one of the most goosebump-inducing moments of the whole trilogy: the lighting of the beacons. The musical score swells as we watch the signal fires ignite across the peaks of the White Mountain, but the reason those beacons are lit in the movie is actually a massive character assassination. In the film, Denethor is depicted as a broken, cowardly ruler who explicitly refuses to call upon Rohan for aid because he's jealous of Aragorn, and a million other reasons as well. This forces Gandalf to dispatch Pippin on a rogue mission to sneak past the guards and manually ignite the warning beacon rebellion of Amon-Din. However, in the novel, Denethor is an incredibly competent, grim, and deeply prepared head of state. He doesn't need a hobbit to sneak around and light the fires. In fact, Denethor had already ordered the beacons to be lit to summon his allies well before Gandalf and Pippin ever arrived in Gondor. And more specifically, the beacons only alert those within the realm of Gondor. It's the reason why in the book we read about many different provinces coming with their forces to aid Minas Tirith, and this includes Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth. So beyond the beacons, the primary method of summoning the help of Rohan was the delivery of what is called the Red Arrow. Denethor proactively dispatches a mounted courier named Hirgon to carry this ancient token, a black-feathered arrow painted red at the tip, directly to King Theoden. The presentation of the Red Arrow is a legally binding summons proving that Denethor was actively managing the geopolitical alliances of his nation. The film ignores this completely, reducing Denethor to an antagonistic madman to create a simplistic narrative where the heroes must circumvent a foolish politician to save the city. It gives Pippin a cool cinematic moment and some awesome music for the movie, but it completely overwrites the intricate diplomatic history of Middle-earth. And by the way, if you want deeper breakdowns for these myths, then check out my series Movies vs. Manuscripts, where I went through each film in the trilogy scene by scene and compared it to the books page by page to find all the differences. So if you want, I have much longer videos where I break down each of these myths in much greater detail. Check those out in the description below. Now let's move on and discuss myth number 5. To maintain narrative urgency in the Return of the King film, the script introduces a dire supernatural subplot. Arwen is physically dying. Elrond explicitly informs Aragorn that Arwen's fate is now magically tied to the One Ring, and as Sauron's power grows, her life force fades. We see her growing pale, dropping a book in weakness, and looking like she has some terminal illness. This creates a cinematic ticking clock, pushing Aragorn to accept the throne to save the woman he loves. And to explain this a little more, let's look at it this way. Arwen is going to the Grey Havens to sail away. She sees a vision of her future child, but this is only a potential future outcome. So she decides to turn around and makes the official choice to stay, hence becoming mortal. But now her life is tied to the fate of the ring, because if the ring survives, Aragorn will most likely die, meaning they won't have the child that she saw in the vision. But if Aragorn succeeds, then the future she saw will come true. This is why Elrond has such a quick change of heart and decides to take the reforged blade to Aragorn. Anyway, I know that was a bit of a side tangent, but a lot of people get confused about this specific point, so I figured now was as good a time as any to explain things. And if you have a different or better explanation for this plot change, you can drop it in the comments below. Anyway, as you can guess, none of that happens in the book. In Tolkien's Legendarium, Arwen is not afflicted by a magical illness, nor is she linked to different outcomes or fates or futures or the ring. As a descendant of the half-elven, she possesses a unique metaphysical right to choose her own destiny. She must simply choose between remaining an immortal elf and sailing west, or accepting the gift of men, which is mortality, to remain in Middle-earth and marry Aragorn. By choosing Aragorn, she does not instantly begin to die of a magical sickness. Rather, she accepts that she will eventually age and die a natural mortal death. After the War of the Ring, she lives a long and prosperous life as queen. When Aragorn eventually chooses to pass away in the Fourth Age, Arwen, heartbroken and truly experiencing the bitter sting of mortality that she chose, travels to Lothlorien and dies of old age and grief at the age of 2,901. And let me be clear that none of this is really included in the main books. Of course, Peter Jackson and his team wanted to spice things up with a bit of romance, and therefore Arwen is included a bit more. Also, it must be said that Tolkien viewed mortality not as a disease, but as a gift that allowed men to escape the physical confines of the world, something that the elves cannot do. By transforming this profound metaphysical sacrifice into a generic supernatural hostage situation, the film relies on a fabricated plot device to force Aragorn into action, rather than letting him proactively claim his birthright for the good of the realm. But now we come to myth number 6. In the extended edition of The Return of the King, there is a highly controversial confrontation between Gandalf the White and the Witch King of Angmar. As Gandalf rides through the upper courtyard of the city, the Witch King descends, draws a flaming sword, and uses dark magic to effortlessly shatter Gandalf's staff into a million pieces. Gandalf is thrown to the ground and is only saved from execution by the coincidental sounding of the Rohirrim horns. This scene represents a severe breach of Tolkien's established cosmological hierarchy. Gandalf is a Maya, an angelic being clothed in mortal flesh, essentially a lesser god sent by the Valar. The Witch King, on the other hand, despite his immense sorcery, is ultimately a corrupted mortal man. In Tolkien's universe, breaking a wizard's staff is a deeply symbolic act of excommunication and revocation of divine authority. A mortal wraith simply does not possess the cosmological power to shatter the staff of the White Rider. In the novel, this physical defeat never happens. Their confrontation takes place at the shattered Great Gate of the city because, if you didn't know, the enemies never actually make it inside of Minas Tirith like the movie shows. Gandalf stands at the front gate to deny the Lord of the Nazgul entry. In this peak moment of tension, the horns of Rohan blow, and the Witch King makes a tactical withdrawal to meet the new threat. The filmmakers changed this to establish the Witch King as an apocalyptic threat, but in doing so, they fundamentally misrepresented the nature of magic and authority in Middle-earth. After all, if Gandalf can take down a Balrog, then the Witch King really isn't a match for him. Next up, at number 7, we have one of the most fascinating changes the movie made to the entire story. Following the victory at Helm's Deep, the extended edition of the films shows Gandalf recovering the Palantir at Orthanc after confronting Saruman. And then much later in the films, we see Aragorn use the Palantir inside of Minas Tirith to reveal himself to Sauron and draw his eye away from Frodo and Sam, who are traversing Mordor. In this scene, Sauron shows him a vision of Arwen dying, causing Aragorn to panic, drop the stone, and shatter his Evenstar pendant on the floor. It portrays Aragorn as psychologically overwhelmed, struggling to maintain his composure against a superior will. But in the original text, Aragorn's interaction with the Palantir is a protective, calculated, and triumphant assertion of his royal authority. You see, Aragorn is the direct bloodline descendant of Elendil, making him the lawful master of the Seeing Stones. The stones are far more responsive to his will than they are to Sauron, who is ultimately a usurper of the artifacts. Aragorn makes the deliberate, tactical decision to look into the stone to help him determine the way he should take. Why? Because this actually happens at Helm's Deep. That's right, after confronting Saruman at Isengard, they return to Helm's Deep for a little bit, where Aragorn looks into the stone. He engages in a fierce battle of wills with Sauron and actually wins. You heard that right. Aragorn picks up the stone, defeats Sauron in a battle of wills, and uses it to see his path forward. This is partially how he learns to take the paths of the dead, and this is also the moment that he reveals himself to Sauron and shows him the reforged blade, Anduril. Ultimately, this highlights the core difference between the literary and cinematic Aragorn. Tolkien's Aragorn has no doubts regarding his destiny. He assumes command with regal confidence. Jackson's Aragorn is built on the modern Hollywood trope of the reluctant hero, so the film inserts moments of self-doubt and mental defeat to give him a relatable character arc. It works for the film, but it betrays the unyielding willpower Tolkien wrote for his true king. Our final myth brings us to the climax of the story at the Black Gate. In the extended film cut, the captains of the West are met by the mouth of Sauron. The emissary taunts the heroes with Frodo's mithril shirt, suggesting the ring bearer was tortured to death. Overcome with grief and rage, Aragorn rides forward and abruptly decapitates the mouth of Sauron with a swift swing of a sword. It's a shocking cinematic moment, but it stands in direct violation of the ethical framework that Tolkien meticulously constructed. In the novel, this violent act absolutely does not occur. The mouth of Sauron acts as a formal herald and ambassador, presenting terms of surrender. When the mouth becomes insolent, Aragorn does not draw his weapon. Instead, he holds the emissary's gaze with such intensity and authority that the mouth literally shrinks back and cries out, "I am a herald and an ambassador, and may not be assailed." Gandalf assures him that he will not be harmed, strictly honoring the flag of truce, and the emissary flees back to the Black Gate alive. In Tolkien's morality, the protagonists are strictly defined by their adherence to mercy, honor, and the rules of engagement. They routinely spare defeated or treacherous foes, because the denial of mercy is the domain of the enemy. Slaying a herald under a flag of truce constitutes a literal war crime. an act of treachery that morally equates the men of the West with the barbaric orcs they are fighting. Jackson filmed the decapitation to provide a visceral, cathartic release for the audience, but it surrenders the moral high ground that Tolkien's heroes were meant to represent. And there you have it, 8 more massive myths created by the cinematic adaptation of our favorite story. While Peter Jackson's films are masterpieces of modern cinema, they definitely altered the underlying philosophical and moral frameworks of the original lore to fit a Hollywood narrative. But what do you think? Out of all these changes, which one annoys you the most? Or which one do you enjoy the most? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're at it, be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next video.